Are we live?
Yeah, I think we're live now.
We are live. Okay. Hello,
Hello,
everybody.
hello.
Welcome to our breakout session. With great Kapwa comes great responsibility, embodying our values in grassroots movement. My name is Danielle. I also go by L. I use they, them, sha. I'm also flexible for any pronouns.
My
And
name is Andre. I work at AFIRE with Danielle as the Tagalog 101 teacher. I also use they, them pronouns or sha. We just wanted to keep in mind, so we were just able to get into the room right now, so we're definitely a little bit off time, so we're going to try to do our best as we move along. But thank you for being here. This is really cute.
yeah, thank you, everybody. Welcome. We're so excited. We see people rolling in. All right. So I will be managing the slideshow. Um,
And then
so
I will be taking a look at the chats and also the Q&A if anybody has any comments or questions that they would like to pose for us. And we can answer them as we go along the way.
yes. Thank you, Andre. So for tonight's session summary, we will be gathering to share some knowledge through storytelling, videos, and some back and forth between Andre and I. You are also, of course, more than welcome to engage with us through the chat. Like Andre said, they'll be helping us moderate that as I lead us through the presentation. And just for some context of who AFIRE is and why we are gathered tonight to have this conversation, as an organization founded by Filipino immigrants, we carry with us the legacy of people power. We believe that the people most affected by structural injustice should be at the forefront of our movements. We seek to amplify the voices of those most silenced in our community, such as undocumented families, new immigrants, domestic workers, low-wage workers, seniors, and youth. So tonight, we're gathering to learn how AFIRE Chicago has been rooting their approach in care in order to inspire and build a more sustainable and liberating future for our Filipinx community. And before we begin, we would like to start off by grounding some energy by having a moment of silence. So while we have much growth to celebrate, many of us are still navigating hardships and grief through this pandemic. So please take a moment of silence with us to honor all those who have transitioned from this life and who cannot physically join us in this space. Feel free to set any intentions, call in any energies, or say a short prayer to ground us in this virtual space. I will be muting myself for a few moments, and then I will gently call us back in before we proceed with the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. And if anybody else has any words or prayers that they would like to share, feel free to leave it in the chat as well.
And when you're ready to join us, you can guide your attention back to the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in that moment of silence. So next, we will go over just some community guidelines. So typically, we use these community guidelines when we have a more open space for discussion with the community. But of course, it'll mostly be me and Andre speaking today with some interactions within the chat. But just like we are learning how to best embody our values, we will be going through our community guidelines just to give a little bit of context of how AFIRE also embodies these values when we gather together. Um, so, Andre, did you want us to like alternate as we go through them?
Yeah, sure. I also just wanted to share that when it comes to these community guidelines, these are things that we practice both prior to the pandemic when we would have in-person meetings. We would share these at the beginning. They're also open to being changed or having like additions added to the community guidelines. It's just so, to help the facilitators also keep time and also to help move discussion along as well. And then as we've transitioned onto virtual spaces as well, having particular community guidelines because not everybody has the same experiences like being online. So having these kind of guidelines helps to move meetings along as well.
Yep.
But yeah, would you like to start, Danielle, with the first one?
Yes, thank you, Andre. So, our first community guideline is to remember that we are all experts of our own experiences. So, we come from so many walks of life and experiences. So, sharing our collective experiences aids us in seeing the whole picture, bridging understanding, and covering more ground. And more specifically, in this conversation, I'm not exactly aware of everybody that's in the room, but for the intention of this conference, there is the potential for us to be talking to folks all around the world right now. So, as we proceed with this discussion, we would like to keep in mind that Andre and I, while AFIRE is so abundant and has so many different parts of the work, today Andre and I will be speaking from our experiences as Phil-Ams who are organizing in the Midwest with AFIRE Chicago.
Hmm. Yeah, and also yeah, so the org's whole name is AFIRE Chicago, and so Chicago is located in Illinois, which is in the central United States. For those of you who don't know, and so yeah, a lot of Filipinos all over the world have different diasporic experiences, and so we will be staying in those. But yeah, can I move on to the second one, Danielle?
Mhm.
Okay, so our second community guideline is welcome emotions. So, in a lot of our spaces, we end up having complex topics and with many people who come in, right, with their own experiences. So, there are a lot of things that might come up for us, a lot of ways that we feel in our bodies and ways that we are reacting to the topics at hand. Just especially because, the history of our people and the history of the diaspora, there are like so many parts and so many pieces to that. And so something that we always like say in our meetings and in our sessions is that whatever emotions we are feeling in our body, to kind of sit with them and allow them to pass, as they will, and not necessarily to shy away from them, because a lot of the times when we are feeling something, that is actually our bodies telling us that maybe there's something that we haven't thought of before, or something that we haven't processed. And so welcoming emotions allows us to not only be vulnerable with ourselves, but also be vulnerable in our spaces. Okay.
Thanks so much, Andre.
Mhm.
And so our next community guideline is confidentiality. So of course today, like Andre and I are very open to sharing with you tonight. But like I said, if we were joining one of our regular fire spaces, we would always want to remember that, we can take the lessons that are learned from the stories that are shared, but also we are within community and we also want to respect folks' privacy. Um, as we move forward in this work as well. And I can pass it to Andre again.
Okay. So our fourth one is take space, make space. So in a lot of different organizational spaces, this goes by different names. But for the most part, what it means is when we take space, that means we are sharing our experiences, sharing our stories, but in a space that is a collective with a lot of other people. We are not the only ones present. We're not the only ones sharing our stories. So we also would like to make space for other people to feel like they can share their stories as well. And in that way, we can kind of foster more of a conversation and not just, one person is sharing a lot, and then it ends up eating up the time of that discussion, right? So it helps us have multiple spaces for people to feel empowered to share their stories. Okay, go ahead, Danielle.
Thanks, Andre. And also, before I go on to this next community guideline, I also want to say that um, these are like all of these in the context are built from our healing justice spaces, but these are also AFIRE values that have been developed and handed and expanded upon over the years. Something that we more recently added that is healing justice specific is root our approach with patience and care. Um, so we want folks to remember to take care of ourselves and others in this space by being considerate of the energy we bring. And we also want to hold awareness of how we share and connect with one another. We don't have to share every intimate detail, but we can learn from the general themes of our experiences. Some ways that we can root our approach with patience and care is remembering to actively listen, which just means to listen to understand versus listening to respond, and being open to receiving the sharer's message. And then sometimes when we have even more sensitive conversations, we might want to be considerate about trigger or content warnings. So if we know, anything can be a trigger to folks, and we want to like let y'all know that even if you join space with us, there's never any obligation to stick around longer than you can or have the capacity to. But one way we can be considerate of joining space together is if we know that something is typically very sensitive, we can just let people give them a heads up so that they have an opportunity to adjust or prepare themselves need be.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to tag on to that. Whether you have meetings in person or online, a really good thing to practice when you want to like have active listening is when you're in person, not having side conversations when somebody's speaking, making sure that somebody is able to share their story in full without you interrupting them. And then in virtual spaces, we like to remind people, I mean, obviously it's just me and Danielle speaking right now, but when we're on like a Zoom call, for example, making sure that after you have spoken, you mute your camera, you mute your microphone again, because there might be like a lot of other noise that will be distracting or may come like bleed into somebody else's like story that they're sharing as well. So yeah. And so that leads into our sixth one, which is to use the chat function for questions, comments, and words of affirmation. So here I already see that Melissa Palma, hi Melissa, hi Isa, has shared the link to AFIRE Chicago's website. So if you would like to check us out, you can just go over there. And similarly to what Melissa Palma has done here, Dr. Melissa Palma, you can also share whatever you would like in our chat function, and whatever questions you have as well. There's the Q&A tab that I see that the interface has. So feel free, and also react as you would like as well, because there are reactions too. Okay.
Thanks so much, Andre. And then we will be moving on to our next slide. And we can go into some basic introductions. So like I said, my name is Danielle. I also go by Elle. I mainly use they, them pronouns, but I am personally open to using any other pronouns. One thing to note is that AFIRE respects and honors all gender identities and expressions. And so we totally understand if this is a new concept to you. But one way we can be considerate of joining space with one another is making sure that when people share their pronouns and with us and information that helps affirm them and like make them feel safe and everything, that is one way that we can extend care. And we totally understand that we can make mistakes. But if we just extend that intention to try and practice and remember that, then it just makes everything, makes everybody feel more confident in building and working and growing with one another. So again, just because I may be flexible to use any pronouns, we want to remember that not everybody experiences gender expression the same way that I do. And with that said, I am the Healing Justice Community Organizer. When I came to AFIRE, I started off as a Tag 101 student with Tita Sally and Tita Nori before it was passed down to Andre. I fell in love with the community and I became a core leader. And, apparently I loved it that much that here I am an organizer now to continue expanding upon this work. If y'all need to contact me, there's my email. And then if you would like to connect on Instagram, I also have that as well. A quick bio about me is that I consider myself an energy bender of Mandarigma, which is warrior and healer. I exist within the in between and believe that my calling in this life is to bridge people through storytelling and creation. In community work, I often find answers to difficult questions by exploring the dynamic of how to honor the individual within the collective. There is no one way to live this life, but I'm so grateful to be in community and to be able to cultivate spaces where we can come as we are and manifest a more beautiful, abundant, and liberated world by learning and practicing what it means to show up for ourselves and to show up for one another. Um, in my off time, I just love to work with energy and to create flow. I love to sing and work with my hands and try new DIY projects. I'm also community and wedding DJ, as I love to play music, celebrate life, and vibe with the broader crowd. My DJ name is Nohya, which is a pun for Walang Hiya, which is for no shame, for having no shame, and then also knowing shame. And I will pass it off to Andre.
Thank you for sharing, Danielle. Hi, everybody. My name is Andre Adricula. Again, my pronouns are they, them, or sha. To hop on what Danielle was saying earlier, when it comes to pronouns, of course, for a lot of people, they either go by he, him, or she, her pronouns. They, them is a set of pronouns that is gender neutral, very similar to our pronoun sha or sia in a lot of Philippine languages. So that's why we practice that in our spaces. And so I am the Tagalog 101 teacher. I originally was a staff member at AFIRE, helping with resource development. But I'm not even originally from Chicago. I'm originally from the Bay Area, and then I ended up moving here. So a lot of my family is in the Bay Area and back in the Philippines. But the work that I do is over here in Chicago in the Midwest. And what I primarily do as the Tagalog 101 teacher, and what I also do outside of AFIRE, is I'm a linguist and also a language teacher. And I specialize in the diasporic narrative. So a lot of my students are Filipinx who are seeking to reconnect to culture. And so what I end up doing is I take into account their like unique individual histories and linguistic experiences, and I tried to tie that to what it would look like to learn Tagalog in a way where they can form their own relationship with Tagalog. Because not everybody, as we know, not everybody speaks Tagalog, and also a lot of folks who speak other Philippine languages such as Bisaya and Ilocano and Kapampangan. We have so many people in the diaspora that speak many different languages, and so not everybody even intends to learn Tagalog in full because ultimately they would like to learn a different language in order to connect with their lolas and lolos who speak other languages as well. So that is something that I take into account, and I move with that in my teaching. And yeah, that's pretty much all I need to share here. If you want to catch me on my Instagram, it's over here. It's wine and chismes. And so yeah, I think we can move on from there, Danielle.
Awesome. Okay. And with that said, before we get into like the breakdown of some of AFIRE's work and our focus of healing justice today, I thought it'd be nice if Andre and I shared like, one thing that we find special about AFIRE and like working with AFIRE. So again, for folks who do not know, we are AFIRE Chicago, which stands for the Alliance of Filipinos for Immigrant Rights and Empowerment. Um, as you can see, we have like some really cute pictures here. We have like an inside joke from 2020 census. It's not sense me, it's sense us. And then we had like a digital Valentine's Day card. This is our staff and board picture from one of our picnics in August. This is our domestic workers. Oops. Sorry, the cursor. This picture here is our domestic workers comite when they had a meeting at one of the members' houses. And of course, we're talking about different ways they're organizing. This is a picture of one of our general membership meetings. They vary a lot, but you can definitely see that pre-pandemic, everybody loved to gather and connect with AFIRE. And this is one of our pictures from May Day in Chicago. So with that said, Andre, did you want to share something that you love about AFIRE before we go into the breakdown?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I just wanted to say, so you said that that last picture was about May Day. Just for people who don't know what that is, over here in the U.S., or maybe it's just in Illinois, I'm not sure. But May Day, or Asian American Action Day, is a day where a lot of people come together, and we go to the Capitol here in Illinois to fight for rights and representation for different communities. And so, yeah, this is an image of some of us from over there. But for myself, something that I really love at AFIRE is the fact that it's an intergenerational space, which is something that I feel like in the diaspora is really hard to come by. There are a lot of Filipinos who may have grown up in intergenerational houses, like with a lola or lolo, some titas and titos, and their parents and the kids. But not everybody whose families have been able to immigrate to the U.S. has that experience. So AFIRE has kind of been a beacon, especially here in the Midwest, for Filipinos to come and meet with one another. Because even though a lot of people when people think of diaspora of Filipinos to the US, a lot of people think of California and of New York and Hawaii. But Illinois actually has the third highest population of Filipinos, except they're kind of all spread out. And it's a little harder to kind of form those community bonds. So that's something that I really love about AFIRE Chicago, because it helps to bring people together, and allow people to connect in ways that maybe they were not able to with their own families here. How about you,
Thanks,
Danielle?
Andre. Ooh, I'll try to keep it quick, but essentially, like, I know that when I was growing up, like, yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood with Filipinos, but um, it was not the same community experience that I had with the fire for sure. um, and I think growing up, I always was seeking for representation that, resonated with me. But what I could before I found a fire, it's really hard. It was when I was growing up, it was really hard to find history books. Whereas like now I have shelves full of Filipino books, right? And before, when we might look like to where our heroes are, and if you don't really know how to like, search the internet or any archives, it's really hard to get that information on your own. Maybe even like 10 years ago, right? It's not the same that it is today. And I remember even being just in middle school and only feeling like the only thing I knew about being Filipino was some Tagalog words, and then just like screaming Filipino food names at each other in the hallway, because that's the only way we knew how to connect with our culture. Um, and when I'm looking for like guidance, and like looking into our history and everything, as we celebrate 15 years with the Fire Chicago this past October, um, I'm so grateful that I don't have to look in books, that when I'm with a fire, it's living history. Being out in the streets and having different demonstrations is very important and has its place. And also just being in community and having these relationships where we can call upon each other and like discuss these things and figure things out together is just so special to me. And so instead of just thinking about history in the past, I'm also thinking about how are we living history together? How are we witnessing each other together? And how is that going to inform how we move forward in the future? And with that said, we can go on to our next slide. Yeah, and then Andre, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how our values guide us to one another, from that context of the last slide.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so this entire session breakout, right? We are talking about embodying our values in grassroots movement, right? And so at AFIRE Chicago, AFIRE originally started back in the mid 2000s with some folks who were part of the People's Power movement, and at the time, like a lot of people, as I said, there's a lot of separation, a lot of isolation of different Filipino families here in the Midwest. And so the principles that we tend to follow in AFIRE Chicago are these three words here. So bayanihan, kapitbahayan, and damayan. Because in this kind of sense, like for those of us who live outside of the Philippines, it's not like we all live in one single barangay where we can all help out each other, right? In the same kapitbahay, right? And so um, even though we have kind of these loose translations of these terms and they might mean something a little bit different to us, because of the fact that we don't have that same kind of kapitbahay or barangay that we can all help each other out in. And so when we connect to one another here in Chicago and in the greater like Midwest area, kind of being able to keep tabs of one another and knowing what's going on with one another, it's really difficult. And so AFIRE kind of serves as a place where we can maintain these connections and also make sure that whatever services we are providing are also reaching out to folks who may only like know one other Filipino person here. Yeah, we have like kind of a growing network of trying to locate Filipinos who need legal help, who need help with naturalization. We're about to talk about that later. And so these three values are something that we really like to embody within ourselves and within the work that we do.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you'd like to share on that, Danielle?
Yeah, I think just like adding on, again, like Andre and I will be speaking from our experiences. And most of that is rooted in the healing justice work sector of AFIRE Chicago. And while healing justice is some language that we use to express some of our ideas and sentiments, we just understand that healing justice isn't anything new. And just using like, again, not every Filipino experience is the same, but at least beginning with these concepts that are a little bit more widely recognized within Filipino culture can at least give us an idea of where to start, right? And with that said, we're going to break down just a couple more concepts before we get into some storytelling and videos. So thank you everybody again for joining us tonight. We're going to do a quick breakdown of our session title. With great Kapwa comes great responsibility, embodying our values in grassroots movement. So as we continue with the rest of this presentation, some major themes that you can look out for, of course, when we're thinking about Kapwa, and we want to think about the power of our relationships. And then, of course, when we think about responsibility, one way we're going to talk about that is the ways that we can be accountable to ourselves and one another, knowing that no one is perfect in this work and that we're all gathering with the intention to help practice so that we can all grow together, right? And of course, like being rooted in our values, we want to talk about grassroots movement. So, how are we moving in a meaningful way? Like, how are we taking action um, and moving forward in meaningful ways? Um, did you have anything to add on to that before we go on, Andre?
Um, Not really. All I just wanted to say is that, as you can see, we do have an emphasis, right, on the relationship, right? So, as far as here we are at a conference that's international, and there's a lot of networking that goes into like being here today. And I just wanted to say that I used the word network earlier when I said we like are finding our people out here, but strengthening these relationships past the networking stage and also like making sure that our movement is sustainable is something that we really work for at AFIRE, which is why we really focus on this embodiment and like making sure that our values are with us every step of the way. So yeah, with that in mind, shall we go on?
Yes, thank you, Andre. Um, so for our next slide, we're just gonna gain like a very basic understanding of what some of these terms means. We don't want to assume that everybody uses the same verbiage that we do. So from our title, what is grassroots? Grassroots essentially just means that we want to make sure that leadership is by individuals who are directly and most impacted by an issue as the foundation of a movement. Um, Thinking about how maybe our ideas are seeds, and who else can better understand how to solve a problem than someone who is impacted directly itself, right? And from those seeds we can grow that movement. Did you want to add anything, Andre?
No, but I just wanted to echo what you were saying about the like growing from these seeds, right? Like when we are really paying attention to the voices and the needs of the people who are at the foundation of the movement, that is how we can help to amplify those voices, right? Because ultimately, you know, AFIRE Chicago as a nonprofit, it's a container, but we also want to be able to listen to the problems and the needs of our people and be able to amplify that outward, such as like when we go to May Day, like I was talking about earlier, to kind of voice to our legislators like our rights and everything. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Andre.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's also really important to say that, of course, Andre and I are here speaking on some of the broader work with the Fire Chicago. But when we're keeping in mind grassroots movement and intentions, we also want to make sure that we are sent. That we're not speaking for others, right? That's also why we focus on we are experts of our own experiences. Andre and I will be speaking from our own perspectives. When of course, like, there are safety issues and like some people want to be anonymous and everything, but ultimately what you'll see how what we're learning to do is how do we make sure our community members feel supported, and personally empowered to share their stories, and how can we do this in a way that makes sure um, it feels good for them as well. So we can move on to the next slide. And just to touch upon embodiment as well. So I know that in a lot of the other breakout sessions, folks are talking about mental health. We're going to touch base a little bit on one of our projects that is helping us challenge the mental health stigma as well. But just to be on a similar page, embodiment is just a tangible or visible form of an idea, quality, or feeling. So again, this is where emotions come into play because emotions are part of the embodiment. How do we feel as we're going through this? That's also maybe our motivation to do this. Um, and when we're talking about tangible or visible forms of an idea, um, we're thinking about how do we bring these ideas to life, right? And then with that said, before we go into healing justice work, we will give a little bit of context about the three pillars of AFIRE's work. Uh, did you want to share about domestic workers' rights?
Yeah, sure. So as you can see, we have these three groups that are called comites, and so as Danielle put, they're kind of the three pillars of our work. So a lot of the people who, whether they're staff members or they are volunteers or our core leaders, they fall into one of these three and help out in whatever way that they can. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the Domestic Workers' Rights Comite. So up until 2016 there was no Bill of Rights for domestic workers for their workplaces, and um, as many of us may know, this idea of OFWs or overseas Filipino workers, a lot of Filipinos who are in both the healthcare industry and also the hospitality industry. We have a lot of our people who are working in people's homes or at hotels, and there prior to 2016 in Illinois, there were no laws that prevented exploitation or any of these things. So AFIRE helped to pass this Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in 2016, and now 5 years later, we've been helping to disseminate that information to a lot of our community here, who are OFWs that are separated from their families. So would you like to talk about immigrant rights as well, Danielle?
Yeah, thanks, Andre. So Immigrant Rights Comite, our main program with our Immigrant Rights Comite is the New Americans Initiative, which also stands for NAI, or our citizenship workshops. So the NAI workshops were actually one of my first opportunities to volunteer with AFIRE. I was very freshly new to the Tagalog 101 classes. I wasn't a core leader yet. I was still new to the community. And essentially what happens is there's volunteer legal clinic, and then also volunteers to help folks go through the very extensive citizenship applications, to make sure that that they have everything in order so that their application can go smoothly. So one thing, not just in the healing justice work, but that was one way that I started learning that, we're not just showing up for the sake of showing up and doing like a task and calling it done. Um, you know, when we talk to these folks, when you sit with these folks, and then you have to dig up some, ask them about some really, sensitive information, things that they might not even remember about, but it also may impact their application. How do we learn how to best be sensitive and like emotionally supportive for our community members who are also stressed out by that process, right? And with that said, we will start getting into the healing justice comite work. So to give a little bit of context, we'd like to go over what healing justice means to us. Did you want to give a little context on what it means to you, Andre?
Yeah, sure. So in the last slide, we were talking about domestic workers' rights and immigrant rights, right? Which are very broad, kind of broad topics that affect us like in a global sense. And so when we talk about healing justice, a really big aspect that we take into account is how a lot of these broader things that that Filipinos experience, that Filipinos here in the Midwest and everywhere in the diaspora, there are a lot of internal things as well that we need to process and heal from as well. And so we were talking about mental health earlier. Some of the other breakout sessions are talking about mental health. But when it comes to healing justice, so when we tie that to mental health, for example, is how do we break stigmas surrounding it within our like Filipinx community? How do we break stigma within ourselves to even like talk about these things and allow ourselves to be vulnerable to talk about these things, right? So a lot of these kind of healing justice movements are about both the intrapersonal, so within ourselves, healing within ourselves, and also the interpersonal, healing within community, healing our relationships with one another. How about you, Danielle? What does healing justice mean to you?
Thanks, Andre. So for healing justice for me, I think it really just speaks to a more holistic approach. Whereas maybe domestic workers comite and immigrant rights comite, a lot of the programming is more about maybe like advocating for structural change or direct services. And of course, we have programs that are taking it beyond that. But healing justice is just like an intentional way to approach the work to make sure that, well, we honor like where AFIRE came from, with, supporting immigrants and domestic workers, as we know that literally Filipinos, like literally globally, are caregivers, and our labor and our people are often commodified. Um, we had to of course ask the question of like who is caring for the caregivers, which is what AFIRE's work came from. And also we had to start asking, well, who takes care of us? How do we make sure that we feel good in this work? And again, like speaking to that sustainability as we are building out a movement. And so we can give a little bit of context before we go into some video shares as well. But did you want to talk about how we embody some of those values in the TAG 101 program, Andre?
Yeah, sure. So the TAG 101 program, or the Tagalog 101 program, right? So it originally was started by one of our long time, I mean, she was originally part of like AFIRE Chicago's original staff, Tita Sally. And so she was the original teacher of the program. And I kind of, I guess it was her ingenue from that. And so here as a Phil am, I was born and raised here. I was actually born and raised in the Bay Area in California. And so I very much have a diasporic Phil am experience. And so I bring that into my pedagogy when I'm teaching as well, because when it comes to teaching, not only just Tagalog, but like to reconnecting to culture and to self, as Danielle said earlier, there is not a lot that we learn about the Philippines here in the US, right? We have like one line in our history books in like 7th grade about the Philippine American War, and that is all that we get. Everything else is like essentially oral tradition within our families, if our families feel comfortable even sharing that with us, right? And so something that I really take into account in the Tagalog 101 class is being really informed about the different traumas that come with that experience, whether it's linguistic trauma, right? People who face a lot of judgment from family members and relatives, like somebody who is made fun of because they have a very like Americanized accent, even though they're trying to learn their parents' language or a relative's language, right? So that's linguistic trauma. We have the generational trauma, things that are passed down from our parents, from our grandparents, just in the grander scheme of the diaspora. And then also educational trauma, where just the educational system here, we don't learn enough about ourselves. And we also have just a very specific way of learning that is entirely tied to kind of productivity. But when it comes to reconnecting, that isn't always viewed as something that is productive by society, right? But that is what ultimately leads to a lot of like death of culture, or like culture disappearing. It is not the fault of the individual that that's happening. It's because it is a systemic thing, a structural thing, that I try to tackle in my lesson. So if anybody has any questions about that, I can definitely talk your ear off about it, but you can hit me up on my social media to talk more about that. But Danielle, I know you have some word to say about our COVID-19 programs.
For sure. Thanks, Andre. And also just like one quick side note about Tag 101, Andre talks about how they use language lessons as a means to like reconnect with culture and self. And I even remember Tita Sally saying that when she did the Tag 101 classes, it wasn't that the younger generation was coming through because just for the sake of learning a language. She speaks to how she could tell that there was this longing for connection, right? And when we think about that, it's like when we think about colonization and how like a lot of this knowledge has been ripped away from us or stolen away from us. um this kind of work, although it might not seem that important, like this is a way that we're not even just healing with ourselves, we're healing with the community because, some of our elders, maybe they feel more confident to speak in Tagalog or a different Filipino language, right? Um, and if we want to connect with them, we have to try to meet them where they're at as well. Or um, if sometimes like folks might feel confident to understand English, but if you're stressed out, if you're anxious and you have to like go submit something or go to an office or something, um you might not be able to have as much capacity to process that information live, right? And so in those ways, like even Tita Sally would literally accompany folks to different offices just to make sure that they had that moral support as well. um, and with that said, I'm going to go into a little bit about how our COVID-19 community support calls have evolved before we go into some video storytelling. Um, but uh, just to like narrate a little bit of our journey during the pandemic, of course, when we first went into the lockdown, um, as many of our community, our caregivers and frontline workers, there was a time when nobody really had any idea what was going on with COVID-19. And so many of our community were suffering alone, as we had to socially distance to keep each other safe. People were also sick and being distanced from one another, right? And so when you don't know that much about what's going on in a pandemic, how do we make sure that we're staying in touch with everybody? And, of course, like right now, we're in a digital conference right now, but what about elders who don't really feel confident to navigate digital platforms? What about folks who literally don't have internet or like smartphones and devices, right? So one of those ways though is that we did have Zoom calls, just to hold space to hear from the community because we can't plan anything unless if we actually know what's going on, right? And so it took a lot of effort from our elders like Tita Sally, Tita Grace, Tita Vanjie, our elders in the community who hold who pretty much are the main connection to our seniors and our elders. They had to help coordinate our community members so that they could get online, and we're still learning how to do that and bridge those gaps as well. um
Oh,
like,
Danielle, I just one thing to share that was shared in the chat.
mhm.
So speaking of that, this kind of idea of accessibility, especially with seniors and elders, mga matatanda, right, of our community. Melissa just noted here that especially health topics, those surrounding COVID-19, a lot of the resources that are created and translated for COVID-19, especially here in the U.S., a lot of them get outsourced to the Philippines, and oftentimes Filipino professionals, people at universities are the ones who end up translating them. However, when they come back here, it actually is in language that is so deeply Tagalog that not all of our elders actually here can understand the resources. And so along with Melissa Palma, I have worked to help to kind of bridge, like create a middle ground of like, oh, these resources are fully in Tagalog, and actually making them a little bit more accessible for our community by making them a little more Taglish, which both kind of is accessible to elders and also younger folks here. And so that's like one of the things that we talk about when it comes to the community help. Accessibility is very important when it comes to having our services be available. Okay, go ahead, Danielle. You have your last thing.
For sure. No, thank you, Andre. And then, so of course, at some point, we do want to remember that we are still navigating a pandemic. The pandemic isn't over just because some people are over it, right? So with that said, that we also want to acknowledge that there is some growth, and there is some confidence that we have been building with the community. And from those initial COVID-19 community support calls, evolved to other programs that we have. So for example, the wellness calls. If y'all have ever done phone banking, I know that some people they love it and it's great. For myself though, I struggle with phone banking, especially when my first phone banking session was to call random people and talk to them about a very polarizing issue about continuing the ability for folks to petition their families. And it was really difficult for me to like be like, you don't even know me, I'm just some random person on the other side of the phone, and having to confront essentially strangers in our community of why they should support that bill when their family was also petitioned over there too. It was really difficult to hear that people were saying, I already did it, so why do I have to care about other people, right? And some of those barriers that we have to work with and take into consideration when we're trying to bring the community together. So with that said, how we learned to shift gears and embody our values was, instead of calling people to only talk about things that we want to talk about, we have formulated essentially like a phone bank, but it's a lot more intentional. We're not calling random people, and we're not only calling them when we need something from them. We call them to check up on them, just like, they pass on information to our titas and our titas pass it on to us. This way, other generations can also, help gather that knowledge to help us understand what is emerging, for what different concerns and needs are emerging for our community as we continue to navigate the uncertainty of the pandemic. And then of course, at some point it was really nice to gather on those community support calls just to hold space for each other, which also came pandemic. So pandemic, of course, is a play on words for pandemic, and also like pandesal and like passing the mic. And so mostly in 2020, and we'll have like an evolved program in 2022. But in 2020, of course, that was like a lot of like the initial uncertainty with what we were navigating, right? And so like, there were very triggering events like the Capitol riot, or the shootings in the South, and other different topics that were coming about. And like, especially when we were learning about Asian hate, coming up all around the country, you know, we used to be able to gather in physical space and comfort one another and everything. But then again, like we had to do that work to transfer it to a digital space, and make sure that nobody, as much as we can, nobody gets left behind. So with that said, I will go on to share a little bit of our Alum project. And instead of sharing 2 videos for the Alum project, I'll probably just share one, just for the sake of time.
Can we share Chris's video?
Yeah. Oh, and really quickly, I'm going to be talking about the Alum project, but I also want to mention that Alum community watch parties came up as well, which I will give context for in the next slide. So now we're going to be talking about how AFIRE puts these these values and programs into practice. So one project that we had is the Alon project. So the Alon project is a storytelling project to help us challenge the mental health stigma within our Filipinx community. What we did is we work with different storytellers in the community to help them feel confident to be recorded and take pictures to help illustrate and demonstrate a more accurate representation of what our community looks like in Chicago. And from that footage, some lessons that emerged from this were, a project like this takes a lot more capacity than we thought. And so we're learning to move at the pace of trust and healing, and taking our time. And also, we didn't want to just, we didn't want to put people's raw footage out, especially when people are talking about really sensitive topics. But we also wanted to make sure that we weren't like gatekeeping these stories, right? And so what we did in our Alon community watch parties is we would watch the raw footage and take notes on different themes that we were noticing in people's storytelling. And people would help take notes so that we can understand what we should try to uplift in the final cut. And before we go into some of these questions, I will share one of the episodes that we have from this project. Let me pull that up.
Thank you for taking care of the screen sharing, Danielle.
Of course. Thank y'all for being patient with me. Okay, so share screen. Window. And here is our first storyteller.
Oh, Danielle, the sound I don't think is being shared. Is there a way to share the sound?
That like
Oops.
when I'm really stressed.
Does the
Well, we can hear it when your mic is on. We can hear it.
Is it okay? Does it do any feedback or anything?
It sounded fine, but I can definitely let you know.
Okay. Yeah, I forgot this isn't Zoom.
Wait,
let's just try it one more time though. Share screen. No, it's just the screen. Okay, so that's okay. Window.
Stress for me feels like I'm splintering as a person. Like if you were to draw like an outline of me as a person, that like when I'm really stressed, like the lines like break apart. Hi, my name is Chris Aldana. I'm 26 years old. I use she, her pronouns. I run Luya Poetry in Chicago, Illinois, and this is how I feel about healing. How do you understand and define mental health? I think for me, that definition of mental health is always evolving. Like with physical health, I can be like, oh, do my joints feel loose? Does my back feel tight? Do I feel tired? Like those are very concrete things I can ask myself. But when it comes to mental health, I often don't think about it. It doesn't occur to me that that is a health thing. So recently, some people asked me like, what are your forms of self-care? And I didn't know how to answer that question. But for me, in all the moments where I have felt taken care of, I've always been in a community space. And I've always been healed through a community space. And I was like, wait, that is self-care, right? Like choosing to not isolate yourself and choosing to like be in a space where you know people will affirm you and guide you. Like that's self-care. I didn't go by accident. I feel really, really powerful when I get to perform poetry and to help other people write poetry. Like in those moments where we create space together to share our stories and to dig deep into things that maybe we haven't found space for yet in our lives or haven't found words for yet, to see that process happen with myself and like with other people collectively, we're kind of unraveling a lot of knots in ourselves. I want there to be flowers. I want silk petals waving softly against our hands. I want to be soft, to plant seeds and watch them grow, to smile like there has only ever been joy. I want to drink sunlight and let it spill out of my mouth when we laugh. I want to listen to the birds sing and mimic their melodies. The guava hangs right off the tree roofs that keep us cool. The leaves wave hello to the wind. We dig our toes into carabao grass, and sampaguita blossoms fall into our lap in our garden. I am trying so hard. I wonder why the stems wilt and the buds don't bloom. I wonder why the trees don't hold us in their shade. The fruits drop and spill their rot everywhere. The sunlight strikes us so heavy. I fear the leaves may burn. I wonder why the leaves have lost their color. I wonder why I can't keep a plant alive. I promise you, I'm trying.
Whew. That poem always, yeah, makes me teary-eyed. Um, and I know like we have like this whole presentation that's coming along, but when we were sharing these stories, I was also one of the storytellers in the Allen project. Um, you can tell that a lot of us had so much that we were holding in, especially because I mean, as Chris's poem was titled "Explaining Depression to My Mother," this relationship with our mental health and also with our parents is something that can be really tenuous and really complicated. And so this project, I feel, and a lesson that really came from this was allowing ourselves to be open to sharing those things with one another, even though it brings up a lot of pain, allows us to also let go of that pain in a way that made us feel okay to share these things. And so yeah, and that's why like when we connect it back to this idea of healing justice, where sharing these things within ourselves gives us the space to move on, and also allow us the space to kind of put into words things that we don't necessarily know how yet to share with our own families. But all of us have so many experiences that are similar, and we can also kind of get advice for those things all together in shared space. So that is such a huge thing about the Alon project, that I think is really beautiful. And it's sad that we were only able to share one video because we have other stuff to talk about, but I hope that y'all enjoyed that performance. Chris is amazing. I wrote in the chat, you can follow them at Luya Poetry, and on Instagram. So, okay, Danielle, go ahead.
For sure. I don't know if you put it in the chat yet, by the way.
Oh, I did. I typed it out earlier.
Oh, like way earlier. Okay. Yeah, no, thank you for that, Andre. I think also this really speaks to the embodiment work that we're learning to do, because again, like just because like we can't assume that people has the same understanding around these concepts, right? Like some of our family, maybe a common narrative in different spaces is like just get over it. um and it's like when you get over it, you're not really dealing with it. And also like Andre said, sometimes we do talk about these topics and it may be a little painful in the moment, but something I've been really grateful for is, and I am so compassionate and understanding of, my caregivers who did not have the knowledge and capacity to extend that patience with me and like help me um process harder feelings. Like I understand like, where that's rooted from and that's beyond them as well. And also it it's really painful to like want to feel seen and heard, and then people just tell you like they just dismiss you. Whereas like I feel like healing justice spaces, like we want to remember that, we are not mental health professionals. Like we support one another and we can help point each other in the right directions, right? um but like Chris said, like it really is special to be able to also create these spaces where we can heal together and witness one another. um and when folks feel brave to share their personal experiences, you feel less alone. And that's kind of part of where the Alon Project came from. So some of these questions, Andre and I are just going to do a quick back and forth before we move on to the next slide. But some guiding questions are like, how did this project come about? And what are some of your favorite memories and or takeaways from this project? We did some takeaways, but something that I think is really cute and like speaks to like not grassroots in a like, ooh, everything's serious, right? And everything has to be so structural and like professional and whatever. When we talk about building out grassroots movements, like it's just honoring our humanity. And what I love about the Alon Project is that it literally came from conversations that we were having with one another in the community. We used to have these gatherings called PCN nights. So that's Filipinx care nights. Andre, shared with us before that traditionally, like maybe like at different universities, different groups may celebrate Filipinx or Filipino cultural nights. But just like we said, in being in alignment with our healing justice values, when we found one another because of this work, and then started understanding that this work it's not even close to home, like it is home, you know what I mean? And if we want to make folks feel safe and inspired to continue doing this work with ourselves, then that means that we have to be really intentional about how we go through this, and like making sure that we're staying true to our values, right? And what brought us together. And that's how this project has had a larger reach, than beyond just like the Chicagoland community as well, right? And one of those ways that the Allen Project came about, not just like talking about the concept, but I even remember like, I'm not fluent in Tagalog, even though I took the Tag 101 classes. And I just remember when we were trying to come up with a name for this project, we were like in a circle in the AFIRE organizing office, and we were like, asking each other, like, what does it feel like? That's that embodiment piece. Like, what does it feel like when we think about healing with community? And some reference that I made was, if folks are familiar with like Kingdom Hearts, there's this scene where like Sora, one of the main characters, ends up like going into the ocean, and it's really dark. And like when we think about the ocean, we think about the currents and we think about the heaviness and how cold it is. But working off of that imagery, I feel like healing with community for me is like, yeah, again, like those feelings might be heavy, but when I share that and, offer that up to the community, I feel like I'm embraced. And like, instead of feeling those heavy, heavy cries that like take the air out of your chest, if you've ever experienced the difference of those types of cries versus like those very peaceful and warm releases, like those warm tears. And I was like, Andre, what is the word for wave in Tagalog? And then Andre just goes to the board and writes it. And I'm like, oh my God, from alone to alone, because together we make waves. And like in those ways, like us just going back and forth with one another is how a lot of this work comes about. Did you want to add anything before we go on to some final lessons emerged, Andre?
Yeah, well, to connect it to the final lessons and also just the origin story, sharing from my own experience, I'm second generation, so I was born and raised here, and something that I grew up hearing a lot from my parents was not to make waves. Yeah, exactly, Luella, as you said in the chat. Together we make waves. And it's so funny because we had, we're Filipinos, so of course we love punny humor, like anytime we can play on words. So the whole idea from alone to alon, etc. But yeah, so this idea of making waves, whether this was when I was in high school. I would hear from my parents, oh, don't make waves, but at the same time, at my high school, and I went to a Catholic high school, for example, they didn't have any space for LGBT students, and so I helped to like start that kind of thing, but that was definitely something that was very contradicting with things that I heard from my parents, which was not to make waves. So when we were creating this project, that was like something that we were trying to materialize, like this idea that there are a lot of waves that we've internalized within ourselves, a lot of like friction and a lot of like sloshing around in our heads that we have not been able to communicate. And so this storytelling project was a way to kind of bring that to the forefront and bring it into fruition. And a lot of the lessons that we were able to learn from that is that we all do truly need a space to feel seen and understood, like when it comes to our experiences and our mental health, because we should not be distancing ourselves from all of the negative things that we are feeling. Because as I said earlier, when we talked about welcoming emotions, the more we distance ourselves from our emotions, the more likely they're going to stay with you and then kind of pile up on top of each other. And then you have a bagyo, you have a storm, right, coming your way. So definitely we do encourage this kind of communication of that at AFIRE. But Danielle, time check, it's 10:22 our time. I'm not sure how much time we have in this session. I'm not sure, Luella, if you could tell us in the chat, because we started a little late. But I think we should move on from the Alon project.
For sure. Oh yeah. With that said, definitely gonna try and stay on time as much as we can. If anything, might stick around until like 15 minutes after, but y'all will have our contact information if you need to follow up on any documents or questions. But before I go on to the next slide, I just wanted to point out, as you look at this photo of all the different storytellers, we're speaking about waves. And so when we so Noel, one of our core leaders as well, who helped like film and like do the whole set and everything of the All On project and did the editing for those first two episodes that we have posted up online, also created this banner and tried to organize it in a way that shows that, again, like together we make waves, right? So with that said, some other lessons that emerged from us were, we were talking about building the project and then even like recording the stories and everything. But what happens when we take it to the rest of the community?
Yeah, and keep in mind that all of these people that we see in this graphic, like we are all part of the different fabric of the Fil-Am community here. We have like doctors, we have lawyers, we have writers and poets and artists, we have teachers. So each of us has our own experience to share in the fabric that is of our entire like global community. So go ahead, Danielle, with the lessons.
For sure. So for our putting it into practice slides, this one is focused on learning to adapt. So again, some of those lessons came about when we took some of this footage and these stories to the rest of the community. So in some of those previous photos you saw, like we had like 50 people or something at some of these general membership meetings, and the ratio from the older to the younger generations was a lot more balanced. Whereas right now I'm going to talk about briefly one of our general membership meetings that was dedicated to unpacking intergenerational bayanihan. So at our GM meetings, this is just like open conversation to the community. People loved this because what we would usually do is, we would get food from Subo, and we would have an hour that's kind of flexible where people can roll in and chica and eat and socialize with one another so that everybody can move at their own pace to ground themselves in the space. And then we would go into our meeting where we would do some organizational updates. And then also we would make some time to have intergenerational dialogue. So you might not be able to see all the details in this picture, but this is actually a picture from our intergenerational Bayanihan GM meeting. You can see Tita Sally up there and me hiding in the back. As you can see, it's a lot smaller of a group. I'm not sure if you can tell, but something that we did notice is that there was a lot, I think there was only 3 elders there, but most of the conversation was made up of the youth. So from that previous banner, when we showed the trailer at this meeting, Tita Sally posed a really important question, and she said, "Where are the seniors?" And that just really spoke to the reality of where we were at, because as most of AFIRE's work is intergenerational, something we've noticed is like when we speak a lot more directly about some of these issues, not everyone is ready to explore that in the way that some of the younger generations might, right? And so even though we did invite elders to be a part of this project, the reality was we had a lot of learning and reflection to do, because the reality is we just were not effective in making them feel confident to work with us in that way, right? And so where the seniors did not only apply to that banner, once we looked around the room, Tita Sally even pointed out that there were not many seniors in that discussion either, right? And so something for some context is that while, again, like most of our work is considered intergenerational, sometimes when we name it, there's like a disconnect in understanding why we are asking to have a little bit more intentional space to explore these ideas, right? Because like Andre mentioned earlier, like, again, a lot of our Filipino experiences are not the same. Even just the difference from like, being in the practicing Bayanihan in the Philippines looks different from practicing Bayanihan just in Chicago, and like the traditional imagery is lifting the nipa hut together to go to a safer spot. Whereas, maybe in Chicago, it's every single summer we help each other move into a different apartment, right? And something that we want to do is like, we don't want to assume that we know everything. We want to take the time to like honor our individuality and all the perspectives that come into this. But one of our community members did pretty much spoke to that sentiment of why we think there was less elders that showed up. And they said, intergenerational bayanihan is already implied. And that's a reality. That's just where they're at, and we weren't going to fight them. But then that brings up the question of what do you do, when you're trying to build a movement where we can move together as best as we can? What do you do when we receive conflicting views?
Yeah, can I speak on that, Danielle?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this idea of, the word conflicting, I feel, is it comes into play because when we are talking about embodying our values in our work, how are we supposed to know how to embody these values or embody our experiences when we don't have words for them, or maybe we don't have these experiences, right? So for this particular project, the Alon project, we were talking specifically about mental health, and that is a topic that, unfortunately, a lot of our elders, and in my own life, a lot of my parents, my titos and titas, it's not really a discussion that people have experience having. And so because a lot of us, like the youth, of course, the topic of mental health is so much more widely discussed now in 2021. but it's also not super accessible to older folks, especially because a lot of these conversations are happening online, or a lot of these graphics are made online. So we have a lot of different terminology and like words that we can use to describe mental health, but for our the elders in our community, it's not that they haven't experienced their own, you know, mental health crises or their own bouts of depression or anxiety or what have you. It's just they literally do not have the words for these things in the same ways that we do. And so that is like one of the struggles that comes into an intergenerational space when we're trying to embody values, because it means we need to create these bridges between, even though we're all in the same community, our experiences are so different, and we need to be able to share the words that we use to describe these things, and also meet people with what concepts they may understand. And so not only in this, but we've had several different meetings, intergenerational meetings, where it's like kind of a topic that that either, let's say, the elders had experience with, like in their immigration, and for those of us who were born and raised here, we don't have any knowledge about that, so we learned about that from them. Or for those of us who identify as LGBTQ, there are a lot of words and terminology surrounding that the elders don't know about. So we would pair a young person with an older person and then have these kinds of discussions. So this kind of idea, like, of adapting our spaces is like very necessary in order to continue embodying these values, because if we don't meet people where they're at, it means that we'll be moving without people. And I think that in this particular case, the Alone Project, a lot of the older like members felt like it was something that did not relate to them, because they don't have experience or words to talk about it. And so that was a big lesson that we had to learn.
Yeah, and like Andre, when you're speaking about like in these ways, sometimes people, folks get left behind or can't really access the conversation in the same ways we do. But that's also why it's really important for us to create space to, even if we're like awkward and we're stumbling over words, like, you know, we need those spaces to practice expressing those ideas, and we can, you know, take inspiration and guidance from on how to express certain ideas and feelings by listening to others as well, right? Um, and so one thing that we had to learn was also, you know, when we're talking about building a movement, you know, we've touched based on like, for me, I believe that real change, like on a collective level, happens on structural and cultural levels, right? Because, you know, again, like Bayanihan is a thing to our elders, Bayanihan is something to us as well, and there may be overlap. But as you know, we move forward with the generations, the culture also changes, right? And you know, that's real if we keep moving forward, but if we're not, you know, making sure to bring it back full circle and learn from where our community has been, it's like we're just doing the same things over and over again and not learning from those lessons, right? And so a lot of our work is learning how to bring that together, so again, so that we can get a true like representation of what we're actually dealing with. You know, we can share some of the knowledge and growth from the experiences that other folks have had before, and that way we can be a lot more effective in creating that change. And you know, just because there's structural change, like just because there's a law or a rule does not mean that people will follow it. It's just a point of reference, right? And so I really believe that, you know, while the law should reflect the sentiments of the people, a lot of that change starts again at home, at the dinner tables and everything, like in these intimate conversation spaces, right? Um, and so the top picture was the intergenerational Bayanihan General Membership Meeting. But as we move forward, we realize, okay, if we just honestly didn't have the ability to make our elders feel confident to be vulnerable with us in those ways, then we also have to try and meet them where they're at. And so we talked a little bit about the wellness calls. And so this picture here is actually So just like there's Panda Mike discussion spaces, there's also Tuesday Club, which is ran by the founding ED of AFIRE, Manong Jerry Clarito, and Manong Jerry and all the other elders that are involved with the fire helped organize the other seniors from Tuesday Club to come to the HANA Center with us and to help us make those important calls to inform our community of why it was important to respond to the census so that we can have that accurate representation and so that we can claim that, that support as well. And in other ways, as an organizer, I look at myself as like a community navigator, and to be able to confidently navigate the community. Tita Sally always says, we are where the people are. And she always talks about how, like, they would go to train stations, talk on buses, and like, even though she doesn't dance, she would go to like the dance clubs to talk to people and everything. And what I realized is that I couldn't just wait to be invited. Even though I was a little scared, I had to face my fears and explicitly express that I had an interest in building that connection with the community and our seniors. And so I started joining Tuesday Club as well, just like a bunch of other of the younger generation in Chicago, and started, what do you call it? Just literally talking over the dinner table. And so I'm going to go into one last video. It's a shortened version of a performance from one of our elders in the community. She also shares a little bit about her experience with the NAI workshops that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. And then after that, we will I will just share some structural tools of, we talked about how to get these ideas into programs and everything, but then of course it's like, how do we take those ideas and put it onto paper? And we can just quickly go over that before we go into one more example of applied practice and open questions. And so again, if there's any issue with the sound, sorry, it's not like Zoom, so I'm just gonna have to leave my mic on. Just let me know if there's any issues with that.
Rolled out of our problems when the different men in the community would volunteer to carry a house to another place, walking, using their shoulders. Yeah, that's the Bayanihan olden times. Today, there are no more houses to carry, but it still could exist during this era, during this millennium. Yeah, with the millennials here in America or wherever there are Filipinos all over the world, that Bayanihan spirit could still prevail in different ways. What is one way? AFIRE Chicago. This is an embodiment of a Bayanihan spirit here in America. My experience with AFIRE is through Banshee. Who shall do my documents? I don't know of any lawyer, and I'm afraid, really. I'm afraid to approach a lawyer. And how much is the fee? I don't have $1,000 for that. So a friend, caregiver, told me, research AFIRE in your cell phone, and that's the number. Call that number. So when I called that number, she answered me, and that's the time when we became friends in 2019. Mabuhay ang Filipino. Mabuhay ang AFIRE. Chicago. Mabuhay tayong lahat. So mga kapwa kong Filipinos, this is the only conclusion that I have. You may have different linguistic affiliations. Luzon, whether you're from Luzon, the Visayas, and Mindanao. Never mind, we just don't think about, I'm an Ilocano, I'm a Tagalog, I'm Superior, I'm a Sambungiano, or whatever you are. We are all Filipinos. We are one for a cause. We are here because of this mission, and that is our well-being. Thank you, AFIRE Chicago. Thank you, Erie Neighborhood House, and thank you to all the volunteers. You really had a kind heart, and that lifted my spirits. This is my key. There is a place I know. I'll be beside is calling us to run and down by the sea's calm. Is calling me, sighing at night and night toward I'll be coming, a place I long to go. Never stop to store my head away. Please keep it for me. I'll be there to take her someday.
Yay! And if you were interested in seeing the full story session and performance, we also have that footage on our Facebook. We live streamed the Bayanihan show, and Tita Marnie, I believe, was like one of the first performers for that as well. I'm just finding the presentation again so that we can wrap up. So again, just to like cycle that back in with the presentation, those lessons of understanding that, you know, we needed to, you know, maybe I wasn't ready to do that when I first became an organizer. You know, I came at a very intense time in AFIRE history, but it was really heartwarming for me to, you know, do that intentional internal work so that I could get out there and meet our elders where they're literally at, you know, and learn directly from them. And, you know, how grateful am I to like have shared, you know, a dinner with Tita Marnie and Tita Vanjie, and, you know, talk again about more issues that impact our Filipinx community, and finding out that we have a lot more in common than we think. So with that said, our next slide. You know, I'm gonna go really quickly over this. I'm just like sharing it just for an awareness. But you know, and when we're talking about embodiment, a lot of this starts with an idea or a feeling, right? And then we explore those ideas in discussion with one another. But before we, you know, we hit the ground running, we want to make sure that we get these ideas on paper so that we can also make sure that, you know, when we speak to the sustainability of this work, you know, different volunteers may come in different stages of a project. And, you know, when we invite other folks in or we continue to move forward, we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of our intentions. There are two structural ways that help us organize our thoughts and ideas when we are bringing these, you know, when we're bringing these dreams to fruition, right? And so one of them is called the pop. So feel free to take a screenshot. You know, you can also Google it. It should be pretty easy to find different examples, but worst case scenario, I will share my contact information again at the end of the presentation if you are interested in looking at these structures as well. So a POP is essentially purpose, outcome, process. Purpose is making sure that you identify what is the purpose of a meeting or a project. For example, one of the purposes for Alon was to create a storytelling project so that we can help challenge the mental health stigma within our community. An outcome, or sometimes we put them down as outputs, are just to outline, you know, what are we trying to achieve? What is the desired result of this meeting or this project? So one outcome that might be more qualitative is how would you ideally like folks to feel after going through a program or having a discussion with y'all? Do we want, or like if you are having a meeting, one outcome can be wanting folks to have a clear understanding of their different roles in a project, right? Whereas you can also put outputs for, you know, do we want a certain number of people, you know, do we want to like touch base with a certain amount of people, or do we want to register a certain amount of people, etc. And then of course process. What I typically do is like that's somewhere where I might put those ideas for consideration. Like, okay, if we know that this is a barrier with our elders and we want to make sure that they can come through, you know, I might, you know, put a QR code there, because that's one way that we are learning how to be accessible in the digital age with our elders. Or I might put the Zoom link, you know, in the process section. And then you can share your facilitation notes and or your meeting notes. The next structural way to help put everything on paper and to make sure y'all stay organized is using the Darcy tool. So POP is about like more of like the program, and then Darcy is about who is responsible, right? So there's a decider, the ultimate decision maker for the project whenever there's a deadlock. Typically in like nonprofits, that might be your ED. The person accountable, which is the person who's accountable for making the project happen. That might be a supervisor or an organizer. For our responsible, those are the people who are doing the work on the project. This includes stakeholders who are responsible for producing work as part of the project. Within our organization, that might be folks like our core leaders, because they regularly come through and keep up with the community and our work. Consulted is the folks that we might solicit input from and, you know, ask for guidance on their specific expertises. For example, you know, as we've been learning to bridge that gap and share that information with the rest of the community, you know, even Dr. Isapama was sharing in the chat some of those barriers that we were able to consult and partner up with her so that we can get this information to our community. And I is for informed, those who will be kept informed of the relevant developments. This is an FYI role. So that might even be just like the broader community. And again, if you'd like to take a screenshot or follow up with me afterwards, those are just two different ways that are really helpful in keeping us focused as our projects expand. And with that said, before we go into open questions and wrap up, one last way that, you know, AFIRE exemplifies these values and embodying our values is through a new program called Circle. So if you see this image, you might see a familiar phrase. It says circle, and then with great Kapwa comes great responsibility. Ooh, I wonder where you heard that from before. But, you know, why I'm sharing this is not only to share some of those lessons from the program, but to also show y'all that, you know, we didn't come up with this name, you know, just for the sake of, you know, being cutesy and everything. You know, we like to have fun and we like to get it done. So it wasn't just the name for this session. It was also taken from, you know, actual AFIRE spaces and conversations that we have with the community. So circle is a means of relational maintenance and accountability. It's also an opportunity to learn how to authentically embody Kapwa with one another. Um, Andre, would you be okay with reading the purpose that's shared on the image?
Yeah, sure. So the purpose of Circle, when we had Circle, so the first part is to gather in a level space. And what we mean by level space is, of course, a lot of people who are here in this room or here at this conference, like work with some kind of organization, right? So there's typically a hierarchy that is present within your organization. And specifically within AFIRE Chicago, we have Filipinos in all levels of like our organization. And so because it is such a community based org, and like all of us are also within the same community, it's very cultural, there are a lot of interlocking pieces. There are a lot of ways that whatever emotions we might have, or like relationships that we might have, like can come into a space. So when we gather in a level space, we kind of can zoom out, and we can look at this hierarchy and also identify what are the ways that, for example, power dynamics in that hierarchy have also affected like the relational dynamics that we have. And so sorry, it's really small. And then so number 2 here is to share the impact of how we have held and navigated our interpersonal relationships. So as I was saying, it's kind of allowing us to have these conversations like through and through, just because we've been talking about intergenerational spaces, and a lot of the organizers at AFIRE, we have a lot of youth there who are organizing with elders and seniors. And then in other areas, like on the board, we have other folks who are older millennials / Gen X, and all of us are Filipino. So it's just a very Filipino experience, which means that there are a lot of things going on, and a lot of ways that we interact with one another as well in our community. So yeah, in leading by example, we were able to have another person there who helped us to kind of facilitate the conversation and kind of point out like, oh, what are reasons why there might be disputes, why there might be conflicts, why there are reasons that things may not feel super good in a particular moment with a particular like program that we're working on, or with some other thing that we're working on. So yeah, does that about cover it, Danielle? I feel
Yeah,
like
sorry, my dog is like, wrap up, because he has to potty. So I know that we're a little bit behind too, but some of the last things that I wanted to share before we open it up for questions, before we wrap up, is if you can see, it does say that this was held on Saturday, July 24th. And, just for transparency, when we talk about grassroots movement, sometimes it may be scary to tread into unknown territory. But again, what I'm so grateful for is to have that guidance and input from our elders who have been in this work even long before AFIRE started, right? And they were able to affirm us that, even when they started AFIRE, and we know of all the good that they've done for AFIRE and how much, the impact that they've had on our community, the reality is a lot of what they did, they had to learn as they went, right? And so Circle was born out of, identifying the need to be like, what, like, we hold the benefit of the doubt that we understand that people aren't trying to frustrate one another and aren't trying to intentionally misunderstand each other. But sometimes when we're trying to share the sentiments and be a single funnel for the community, right? And we're also trying to come from the perspective of an organizer and like creating programs. And then we're also talking about how we are personally impacted in this work. And then we're trying to like talk about how all those different experiences intersect. Maybe that's a little bit overwhelming to hold, and also for me and other folks to also lead a conversation. And so when we talk about sustainability and asking for the support that we need, like Andre said, what I was really grateful for, I know, Bubba, what I was really grateful for was that when we expressed these needs and concerns, our ED, our board members, everybody came together to make sure that we could have that kind of support going into that space. And I think that's pretty much it. So, unless if there's anything else you'd like to add, Andre?
No, I mean, in the chat, somebody who works with FilPro would like to see the dog.
Oh goodness. Oh, he's big. Let me see. Hold on. Come here, baby. Come here. Come on. Come on. Somebody wants to see how cute you are. Oh my gosh, he loves being carried though. Can y'all see him? He's big boy. He's big boy. And I have some cats hiding around. Yeah, he's big boy. But with that said, that is pretty much our presentation. And we'd like to open up for just general questions. Otherwise, if folks don't have any specific questions and want to follow up separately, if you could, we're wondering what is one takeaway from this space and this presentation so that we can better understand the impact of what we shared today.
Yeah, so here you can feel free to just put it in the chat and then I can read it out. But otherwise, if you have other, if you have like comments or questions that you have, we can, of course, play. Is our contact info at the end here?
Oh,
or
yeah.
would we have to?
So our contact info is right here if y'all need to follow up with us at all.
Yeah. So if any of you are working in different organizations, whether you're here in the U.S., somewhere else around the world, or back in the Philippines, and want to know more about just what it looks like to build a grassroots organization, or to kind of come into like meeting with one another, because everybody has like different experiences. And that's a whole like thing that we can talk about. That's like a meeting on its own, right? So yeah, if anybody wants to know any more, you can just message us either here at ddevera@afirechicago.org or acentoadroit@gmail.com. These are our emails, or you can find us on Instagram as well, at nohia and wine and chismis. Okay, so wait, we have a couple of people in the chat. Interested in following up. Okay, well, Mila, we will write down your email and we can email you after this as well. FilPro, you got it. So no hiya. So no one understand our shame, and also walang hiya. It is okay. This is our reclaiming. It is okay to be walang hiya.
Yes.
Because we need to reclaim ourselves and the fullness of our beings and our humanity. We are all human. So
yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, if that's all there is, thank you all so much for sticking with us. I know that like we were a little bit behind, but we're so grateful to share this virtual space with you and to further connect in the future as well. Oh yeah, and then I'm not doing anything tomorrow night. I'll be at the karaoke session. I hope Andre comes through too.
Yeah. Let me clear up. I'll try to clear up my schedule. We'll do it.
For sure. Yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Please get some rest, and we will be in
or whatever time it is.
Yes. Oh yeah. Whatever time it is, wherever you are, be safe and have a great time.
Okay. Mag-ingat kayo.
Bye.
See y'all later.